Dr. Dani Sulikowski, one of the most interesting and I think controversial academics in Australia today. Welcome to the NatCon Australia podcast.
Thank you. Very happy to be here.
A pleasure to have you on. Dating and discussion about dating on the internet tends to trend highly, far more so than pure, dry discussions about politics. This obviously shows probably the revealed preferences about what people are truly concerned about. So let's start with a nice, friendly icebreaker topic, which men can use next time they meet a nice girl in a bar. Dr. Dani, what is female manipulative reproductive suppression, and why, in your view, is it destroying Western civilization?
Look, let's start with a nice, easy one. Look, I'd probably say, don't take that up to someone in a bar. I think that's probably not. I'd say it's probably not a great icebreaker. Look, it's really what it sounds like. So, put aside for a moment any notions you might have about people's conscious motives, because that's an unrelated, separate issue and a separate discussion. But talking about the ultimate functions of people's behavior. And so when we're talking in scientific terms, in evolutionary terms about behavior, we're concerned not about what the individual believes they're doing or what that they think they're doing. What we're concerned about is just what are the consequences of that behavior, because it's the consequences of behavior that are the currency of evolution, if you like. Evolution doesn't care if you're happy, if you're sad, why you think you're doing what you're doing. It just cares what the outcomes are. And so what we're seeing at the moment is quite a large number of readily identifiable female behaviors whose consequences are to suppress the reproduction of other women. And so what I would posit, I guess, what the crux of my theory is, that the birth rate declines that we're seeing across all Western countries, but it's not even restricted to the West. So we're seeing the same thing in Japan, in South Korea. And I mean, some people consider Israel to be the West, but we see similar things in parts of Israel's population as well. So this is most certainly not a Western specific phenomenon, but what it does ultimately is it drives birth rate down to the point where you see population collapse. And the way our world is currently organized around populations, if you get serious population collapse, you're going to get civilizational collapse. That's going to be an unavoidable end result.
And is the terminology yours, or is it something that you've expanded on?
It's not wholly mine. So the concept of reproductive suppression comes from behavioral ecology, which is just the study of the adaptive consequences of behavior, which certainly most behavioral ecology researchers has tended to exclude humans, either because of some misguided idea that the same principles don't apply to us, or because of perhaps a much more accurate idea that humans are just a really complicated species to study. So we're not a great model system for any research question, right? We're just to answer any research question, you want the simplest model system you can find that has the least number of other extraneous variables getting in the way of the particular ones that you want to study. So that makes humans a less than ideal system for pretty much anything, unless your research question is specifically to do with people. So within the world of behavioral ecology, there is this notion of reproductive suppression, and it's probably most famous both within and without behavioral ecology in rats. So it's kind of well known that when a particular female rat comes into becomes fertile and becomes able to breed, the other rats in that same colony, the other females, will become infertile. And so that's reproductive suppression, the behavior of one female resulting in females around her breeding less effectively. So it's not a novel concept. The notion of manipulative reproductive suppression is a little bit more specific than that. So in rats, and I'm not necessarily an expert on rats, but in rats, there's at least some debate as to whether the reproductive suppression is manipulative, or whether the female rats around the dominant female are actually making a decision that's in their own benefit not to breed now. Like, their net reproductive lifetime success will be higher if they don't breed now, they breed later, or it's some other opportunity in some different circumstance. So whether that's manipulative or not is up for the up for debate. There's some evidence, in fact, that it's not. What I'm arguing in women is in human females in women is that it is manipulative, which means that the behavior of the individuals who are not reproductive, who are choosing not to reproduce, whose behavior is being manipulated such that they don't reproduce, is not in their reproductive interests to do so. Which means that behavior is being manipulated. It's not actually serving an adaptive purpose to them. So that's the difference between just reproductive suppression and manipulative reproductive suppression.
Yeah.
Whether or
I
not
mean,
it's interest of the people to
it's obviously hugely important because it provides an explanation for not only, like you say, the collapse in birth rates worldwide. You argue, I mean, there are other explanations which we'll get into, but also at a personal level, individuals who don't start families and don't have the opportunity to have children and the like of it. So it does matter. It's a controversial subject matter, though, for I think kind of obvious reasons, and I think one that many, particularly women, would probably feel uncomfortable with. But also, I suspect a lot of more typical, more politically correct academics would shy away from. So perhaps it's worth giving a bit more info about not only your academic background, but a little bit of your personal background. Did you always get interested in this topic, or was your family always discussing these
No,
political
no.
issues? Yeah.
So my academic background, my training is much more in behavioral ecology than in which is typically not focused on people than it is in the behavior of people. Largely through getting a job at Charles Sturt Uni, where I work currently, and I've been there for 15 years. The facilities and opportunities for animal research weren't great, and so it made sense to pivot to human research. And what I discovered quite quickly is that the application of behavioral ecology principles to people is done, in my view, typically very poorly. So there's I think there's two sort of ways in which that can go poorly. One is this idea that humans have somehow reached some sort of endpoint of biology or endpoint of evolution that's somehow in our past and behind us, and that those same principles don't dictate current behavior. Or a softer version of that argument is that the environment we have created around ourselves is so different to the environment we evolved in that any behavior we get from evolved mechanisms now is just going to be some inexplicable, superfluous, artifact. Right. So the way my academic career developed was basically by saying, well, I mean, both of those ideas are nonsense, and being a little bit surprised to discover that it wasn't well understood that both of those ideas are nonsense. And so I built a little bit of a research focus for myself in just applying really quite non-controversial, straightforward understandings of the evolution of behavior to people, and discovering that in some sense, some of those ideas, some of those applications were quite novel. And you're right in that it is to some extent controversial. I mean, it's never bothered me. I've never really cared very much either way. It's just not. It's not something that's very high on my list of priorities. Whether or not something is controversial, it's certainly not going to deter me in any way. But in some sense, it is controversial because what we have, I think, in the political dynamic at the moment in Australia, but just broadly across the West and the developed world, I think is this really, really unproductive conflation between how the world is and how we would like the world to be. And when you start asserting that the world is something other than how people would like it to be, then people get quite angry and upset. And this is where I think that's where the controversy and the negative responses to these types of ideas come from, is that there's this a misunderstanding, I think, that the people who are saying that the world is a certain way because that's how they want it to be, they then assume that someone who's saying, well, actually, no, the world is a different way, they assume that must be because that's how they want it to be. So rather than seeing it between a competition of ideas and theories to explain how the world is, they see it as a moral competition as whose version of the world is better. And so you've got this conversation at cross purposes. And for the most part, I tend just to try and ignore those conversations because I don't my experience is that you don't get very far.
Mm.
If you can't agree on some common understandings of what it is that you're talking about, um, then you're just wasting valuable time and energy attempting to engage in those debates. So I've tended just to largely ignore it. So my academic career is sort of I've landed in female intersexual competition much the same way I landed in previous things I've studied, which is just observing that what was out there in the scientific literature, what just wasn't very good. To me, it didn't gel in large part with what sort of a broader understanding of mating systems, not just in humans, but across the animal kingdom. And that's one problem with evolutionary psychology, is that there are some great evolutionary psychologists to whom this doesn't apply, but there are also a lot of, the field itself is insufficiently informed by a broader understanding of animal behavior. So my background being in animal behavior brings a different perspective to what a lot of other people might bring to the table. So I just observed that female intersexual competition, which is really just describes in its most simplest level, it just describes how women compete for mates. And so that's where these theories began. It began unpicking the what was sort of, I guess, the status quo, or the sort of current understanding. Not much research had been done on it anyway, so there wasn't exactly much of a field consensus. But to the extent that there was any consensus, I felt it was largely missing the point, and really missing where all the action was. So
Mm.
that got me into intersexual competition, understanding how women compete, female aggression, and then looking at how that plays out over the course of the lifespan. And that led me to this notion of actually what's actually happening now is intersexual competition is a much less important driving force behind female behavior in current societies than reproductive suppression. And that's where I've kind of landed, is that women are less interested about competing with each other for mates, and they are much more interested in engaging in these reproductive suppression tactics and behaviors.
So to raise a sort of obvious objection, which I'm sure you've heard before, but maybe my viewers haven't, um, that makes sense, I guess, in the broad. There's a logic to it. But how do you explain the fact that um, highly educated women in the West tend to have far less children than they would have in the past? If it is a case that a particular class is suppressing a broader group of their female competitors, if that's the correct
Yeah.
terminology, wouldn't you expect the opposite? That those let's call them like high end women have stacks of kids and the rest don't? But that's not what we see occurring, right?
No, that's right. And so the reason why, no, it's not what we see occurring, and it's, although in some senses it sort of is. So there are some interesting observations that people have made, like, for example, female CEOs, so heads of company things, really high up women, actually tend to have more children than the women they employ. So they employ women below them who work very, very hard and put in the kinds of hours that people working in that upper echelon typically put in. However, the women that run the companies actually tend to have more children than the women who work for them, who tend not to have children because they're working too hard and too long
Mm.
hours. So actually, in some senses, what you're suggesting we do see in little microcosms. However, it's really important to remember that it's not just about quantity of offspring, it's also about quality of offspring, and it's about those offspring's own capacity later on to successfully reproduce. So taking just a one-shot number of children view of whether or not behavior is adaptive or should be selected for or should be expected to be seen really just narrows it down. And in some cases, because it's not a terrible proxy, in some cases it works. So, the count babies argument is not a terrible proxy for what behaviors are more adaptive, or let's see which people do them and how many babies they have. It's not a terrible proxy, but it really doesn't work in an environment of manipulative reproductive suppression where the birth rate is actively moving down over time, that the number of babies had in each generation becomes less important. So what's really important for ongoing reproductive success is that you have children that you are able to invest in, that stay at the high status levels that you are at, who are then themselves able to have children, and you're able to eke out that long-term reproductive pathway. That's going to preserve your genes in the population much more than, let's just say, a woman who has more children, but very few of those children actually themselves go on to have children. Or if
But
they do have children, Yeah.
But it's different in the past, right, where you had aristocratic families, let's say in England, with who were wealthy and had large numbers of children, and the lower classes who actually struggled because of economic conditions and other things and had less children. So, so isn't that a different type of sort of reproductive suppression, which would sort of be the
Yeah.
more natural kind of result of what you say is occurring today, but through a different method?
Yeah, so one of the key differences that we see between sort of going back in time when wealthier people had more children that survived better and now is one of the key changes that we've gone through as a society is that wealth no longer gives you differential survival of children. Or necessarily even differential fertility. Maybe around the edges, wealthy people can afford access to fertility treatments, but generally speaking, wealth used to afford greater reproductive success through greater differential survival of children. Um, that doesn't happen anymore. So when society lifts itself up to a point where the wealth differential is no longer affording the wealthiest, highest status women excess reproductive success, we end up with a evolutionary problem for those wealthy women. So you've got right because the currency of evolution is reproductive success, not wealth. So if you're not turning your wealth into reproductive success, then you're going to be, what's going to be very strongly selected for is mechanisms that will turn that wealth into reproductive success. So what do these high status women do? Well, so let's look first at this demographic transition. So we know that when societies reach a certain level of GDP, certain level of wealth, we start to see birth rates falling, right? So fertility falls, right? So death rates fall. But then birth rates fall. And the main reason for that initially is that if you have a lot of children because you expect half of them to die, well, when half your children are no longer dying, the ideal optimal number of children for you to have then also drops, right? Because you can only have so many children that you can adequately invest in, right? That you can adequately invest in and care for and keep up in the high status of society or whatever status of society you're in fact. So the first thing that happens is that birth rates begin to fall. Now, the wealthiest people, the wealthiest women, the birth rates fall, and they reach a new optimum where for the wealth and whatever they have, it's not beneficial for them to necessarily have more children. That's what an optimum means, right? You find your new optimum for the number of children you want to raise. Having reached that optimum, if you then discover that the women below you in the social hierarchy, with their fewer access to resources and less access to status, are having just as many children as you are, well, now we've set the evolutionary stage for behaviors to be selected for that will do something about that. If you're already at the optimal number of children, then having more children is not optimal, right? You might have excess resources to spare and you might have some time to spare. But having more children is not the way to increase your reproductive success, or you would already be having more, right? That's what an optimum is, right? It's the best number you can have for the distribution of your resources through those children to guarantee their long-term success in the population. So what do these high status women do with their extra resources and their influence? Well, they begin spreading social norms, they begin changing social norms to try to convince women generally to have fewer children. And so what you see is the background rate of reproduction dropping. And this is sort of from an evolutionary perspective, this is a really important mechanism to understand. So I imagine you would already be familiar with the idea that the reason why societies send men to war is because a society can afford to lose a large proportion of its men and its population can recover within a generation as long as it hasn't lost hardly any women, right? Because women are the reproductive cap on a population.
Mm.
Okay. So for exactly the same reason, you don't see men as an intersexual competition strategy attempting to suppress the reproduction of other men. Because even if you manage to suppress the reproduction of 80% of men, which is what happens in war, you suppress the reproduction of 80% of men by sending them off to war and they get killed, right?
Mm.
Even if you successfully manage to do that by some sort of social means, the net reproductive rate of the population wouldn't change because the remaining men would be able to pick up the slack, if you like. So for men, you don't see this same selection pressure in favor of reproductive suppression tactics. However, given that women set the cap on a population's reproductive capacity, if the women with influence are able to generally convince the women below them that it's much better to have fewer children, then you will see the overall rate of reproduction in the population begin to fall. And
And
that
you,
does then give returns on investment.
and you say this explains a whole host of social phenomenon, everything from gender ideology, which encourages people not to reproduce in some cases, to encouraging women to focus on their career during their childbearing years, to cutting their hair short so as not to look as pretty as they would otherwise, and a whole host of other things. And you can kind of go through other phenomenon today. I might just throw a couple at you, and you can respond as to how your theory would fit to them. There was a recent announcement in the UK, the health minister, Wes Streeting, who is making much more widely available weight loss drugs. And he said by 2035, the UK will supposedly be, quote unquote, fat free. Under your theory, shouldn't elite women who can currently afford these weight loss drugs be against their widespread use?
So women's weight is a really interesting thing. So women have an ideal weight range for reproduction. Outside that weight range, it becomes much less easy to reproduce. So, I mean, people know quite well that if women are too skinny, they actually stop menstruating and stop cycling entirely. However, it also turns out that being overweight is a tremendous risk factor for pregnancy and birth as well. So there's a relatively narrow weight range. So female weight has always been a fertile playground for female intersexual competition and reproductive manipulation. So there's some theories out there around anorexia being a form of intersexual competition. And Elizabeth Mealy had the best take on that, and her argument was that it's not men who are setting the social norms for a woman's ideal weight, it's women who set those. And I think we can see that now with social media. So, back in the 80s and 90s, when the boogeyman was, the mass media making women feel like they had to be skinny by putting all these models. Well, now we've got social media, which is completely decentralized. And what content do women produce and consume? Well, content of these ridiculously ideal bodies that it's not healthy to have. So it was never driven by mass media. It was driven, women set body norms for other women to follow. Now, most of the time, throughout much of, say, the last 100 years, women were actually thinner than the ideal male preference of female body weight. So, and that's been measured in a bunch of different studies. If you get men and women to adjust women's bodies to make them ideal, the male version of the ideal, the most attractive woman, is going to be heavier and curvier than the female version. So it's women who have manipulated this idea that, if you need to be super skinny for men to find you attractive, and then they manipulate that and they socially enforce that. And so, we got the anorexia sort of social contagion of the 90s that sort of went around, 80s and 90s. But even before that, we had all of these trends. You had Twiggy in the 60s and you had the flapper girls in the 30s. And, we've always had these skinny trends. So nothing at that sort of extreme level can be maintained for very long, but it does get maintained for some period of time. And so you've got these women sort of policing other women's weight, making them much less skinny than is ideally healthy for fertility, but also making them less attractive to the men that they think they're getting skinny to try and attract, right? So you got the socially dominant women setting these hyper skinny norms. Then something happened, right? The society changed, fast food, more sedentary lifestyles, a massive boom in the knowledge industry. So a lot of people whose job involves just sitting down all day. And what happened is people got fat. All of a sudden, the average woman was heavier than the male ideal of what the most attractive woman looked like. So then it doesn't make sense for competitive women to manipulate other women into losing weight. That's going to make them more attractive. You're not going to manipulate your rivals to make themselves more attractive. And so what did we then see was the next body trend to emerge? Body positivity. All right. And all of a sudden we started to see this celebration of these overly obese and, very dangerously overweight body shapes. And so that was kind of, instead of seeing another skinny girl trend, instead of seeing another heroin chic or another Twiggy, we saw this oval, this celebration of overly fat body shapes. And now you've got Ozempic coming in, where now we're going to see. And so I don't know necessarily that I would suspect, given that the majority problem in society is just as far as straight relationship between body shape and attractiveness, and therefore appeal to the opposite sex, is that most people are too heavy. Therefore, I would generally expect some resistance from feminist women and things like that to widespread availability of, the skinny pill. However, more importantly than that, assuming that this pill is going to become widespread, I presume that's what's going to happen. It's already sort of happening in the US. I presume that's what's going to happen. If the consequences of that are to effectively, obliterate the obesity crisis, then I would expect the next body fad in women to go back to one of the ultra skinny ones, and to see the end of this celebration of body positivity. That's what I suspect.
Interesting. He said, interestingly, the health secretary over there, that over half of his parliamentary colleagues are taking fat loss drugs, which I found incredible. So, they would be considered like the elite, and so they had an advantage, at least in some respects, if you follow the line of reasoning. And I'm just trying to think through your logic. You would be thinking then, whether subconsciously or consciously, that they would not want to have the advantage given to other people in that respect that they have.
I would imagine so.
Yeah. On another point, I mean, hasn't there? It's a compelling argument about why reproductive suppression exists in certain areas, but I wonder whether it's the sort of grand unified theory that you sort of want to make it to be. There's always been anti-natalist thinking, and many of that was driven by men, right? I mean, you had Thomas Malthus in the late 18th, 19th century. You had Paul Ehrlich in the mid 20th century with the population bomb and there've been state policies in China, most notoriously, which I don't think was women driven. So doesn't it show that it's anti-natalist ideologies of various descriptions have always been floating around, and they can exist separate to your own explanation about why it might be occurring in more in modern times?
I think to some extent, yes, but I think that it would be a mistake to presume that anti-natalist policies floating around anywhere are not part of the human mating system, right? So we should expect to see attempts. So so humans are largely cooperative, living in these large societies, and yet evolution selects for not just people but all individuals, right? Evolution is inherently competitive, right? It is a survival of the those that have ultimately the most net reproductive success, inclusive reproductive success, which is not just your reproductive success, but that of your relatives as well. So those whose genes persevere into the next generation are going to win the evolutionary race. So there's very heavy selection pressure to manipulate the reproductive behavior of those around you. So humans exist in this complex society which relies on tremendous amounts of cooperation and trust and mutuality in order to exist. But within that is always been tremendous amounts of policing of each other's behavior, manipulation of reproductive behavior, because there is a constant ongoing selection pressure to try and win that reproductive war. So I don't think any example of anti-natalism, whether it's come from this particular scholar or from the CCP, which is reasonably safe to assume is a male-driven phenomenon, although not entirely. But none of those things would be able to be explained without recourse to understanding how individuals benefit from manipulating the reproductive behaviors of others. Right? It's none of those things exist in a vacuum. It's kind of like what I was saying at the beginning. But
even Xi Jinping, the leader of China, only has one known child, so he was subject to it as well. And so
one
again,
known, I think known might be a pretty important. I'm serious. I think known would likely be a very important word in that sentence. I mean, and that's not even. I mean, China is not exactly known for openness and transparency, but even aside from that, a lack of transparency and manipulation is a core tenet of reproductive manipulation, intersexual competition. So what you've got in any kind of social behavior like this, where you're attempting to manipulate others, is you've got what you're actually saying and what your explicit stated goals are, but then you've also got what you're actually signaling to others, right? And so you've got what other people can take away from your behavior. Now, if Xi Jinping were to openly say that he has large numbers of children, I have no idea whether he does or not, but if he were to openly say that he did, that would be sending a very different message to China's people than him saying, I only have one child. And so whether or not he makes public that he has many children or one child is probably much less causally related to how many children he happens to have, and is much more closely related to the signal that he wants to send to the Chinese people. So from that perspective, I think we probably don't know how many children Xi Jinping has.
Who knows? Speculate. What about this sort of more another obvious objection that the reason why birth rates have collapsed has been, for better or worse, the introduction of the contraceptive pill and the sexual revolution of the 1960s. That was driven by other females, do you think, or was it just them taking advantage of, in order to suppress population, or was it them taking advantage of it because that's what they wanted to do?
So in terms of the, in terms of the really wide uptake of the pill, that it certainly is part of a social contagion of a feminist movement that devalued motherhood and devalued reproduction. And certainly the pill introduced a very, very easily accessible way to both to control your own reproduction, but to manipulate other women into suppressing their own reproduction. So whereas previously you might have needed to rely on less palatable means to achieve the same purposes, now what we're seeing is just kind of like sort of a real greasing of that pathway, right? It just now makes it very much easier to push women down that. And certainly if you look at the birth rates, we certainly see a steep and sharp decline with the introduction of the pill. And one of the reasons for that, or perhaps one of the sort of primary mechanistic reasons for that, is that the majority of human babies, as in common with most other sexually reproducing animals, were not planned, right? So the way babies happen in the absence of readily available and highly effective contraception is just that people have sex, right? People have immediate sexual motives and urges, and they engage in sexual behavior, and then babies happen. So when you introduce a form of contraception that can be, which is what the pill is, a form of contraception where the contraceptive decision is not coupled with the decision to have sex in that kind of heat of the moment kind of way, then what you do is you begin to eradicate a lot of the by accident babies, which of course is the way, which is the natural path by which reproduction occurs. Reproduction did not rely around family planning for much of human history. In having said that, though, you shouldn't underestimate the extent to which other means were used to manipulate reproductive success, both by women themselves and by their families and the women around them. So I think we've all heard the horror stories of children's homes and things, where unwanted children were born and they were sent, and typically horrendous things, they typically weren't treated very well by the people there who were caring for them. So, society has always, sort of society at large and individual women have always had ways in which they could manipulate and suppress their own reproductive output and the reproductive output and success and things of others. So the children that went to those children's homes, they didn't have a very high chance of growing up and having successful, healthy, happy relationships with more children. So yes, you might have had that child, so there'd be some nominal reproductive success there. But if the way that child is raised is not itself conducive to successful ongoing reproduction, then it is like an end of that genetic line. The other thing that's really interesting to observe is that a decline in birth rates is also not unique to the here and now. So this is something that we see at the decline of civilizations fairly commonly, right? So at the decline of Rome, there was a baby bonus to try and make women have more babies, because women were not having babies and instead they were getting involved in civic life and things like that. So yes, the reproductive pill, the contraceptive pill, has added a dimension that wasn't there, and it may have accelerated a birth rate decline that was going to happen anyway. But I don't think it's some sort of unique golden factor that in the absence of it, birth rates would have just, rumbled along and kept a stable, slowly growing population forever into eternity. That was not going to happen. It's not how human populations go.
I, I, I know there's a theoretical kind of debate about how intentional this is or conscious this is, but wouldn't it just be more correct to say that there is a nasty side to some elements of female intersexual competition, and they do have a motive to repress the sexual reproduction of their peers, but that it's more of a character trait in particular women rather than a sort of something which exists to the same degree across the board. Aren't there some nice girls out there that sort of, support others and like to see civilization thrive?
Look, so it's a really interesting question. So intersexual competitiveness tends to correlate quite strongly and quite positively with dark traits. So psychopathy, narcissism, Machiavellianism, sadism. So all the bad things, right? So to some extent you are correct in that intersexual competitiveness is viewed as a somewhat stable individual difference trait, and it tends to load onto the same types of things that the worst people in society's traits load on, right? So correlates quite strongly with those. It's in that little packet. However, what we're sort of seeing is that there's a shift in the proximal mechanisms for competitiveness. If we think about competitiveness as being a competition for mates and a competition for resources, so like a scramble competition for mates and a scramble competition for resources, and it's about, stabbing everyone else in the back and getting as much as you can for yourself. There's that kind of side of intersexual competitiveness. However, what seems to be happening in the manipulative reproductive suppression space is you're actually seeing those types of behaviors tending to correlate with a more not necessarily nicer people, because there's not that strong a relationship between the two. It's not like you can really be highly competitive for mates or you're really reproductively suppressive. But the reproductively suppressive stuff tends to correlate much more, at least with what's consciously reported, much more consciously reported pro women attitudes. So this idea that, women will be much healthier and happier, have much more fulfilled lives if instead of becoming mothers, they will have these wonderful, outstanding careers. So on a proximate level, in terms of what people believe they're promoting when they are spreading the types of ideologies and social norms that we know ultimately end up suppressing reproduction, in their conscious mind, they're spreading very pro-female ideals. So there is a bit of a disconnect between the more proximately competitive stuff, which is associated with the nastiness, and then the reproductive suppression stuff, which at least mechanistically appears to be piggybacking off pro-social types of biases and wanting, to have wanting other women to have these happy lives. So the kind of archetype, I guess, that sort of sits in the middle of that is this older woman who herself had many children, who themselves sort of gone on to have happy families, but tells all these other younger women, don't do what I did. I never had a career. All I had was children. Oh, how horrible, a grandmother of 17. What an awful outcome for you. But boy, I never had a career. So, don't get married young, don't have children, put your career first. And in fact, put it first until you're around about 46 and pretty much can't reproduce anymore. Then try to start a family. That's the time to really
And
go.
You would say that that's not them. There may not even been them consciously doing that. That's just what innately they're just, that's the message that they're sent. Their selfish genes are sending or something.
Yeah, I mean, that's not a bad way of putting it. That's right. So, again, what evolution cares about is not why you're doing a particular behavior, but what the consequences of that behavior are. And so if women in the past who have encouraged other women to do, whatever vocations might be available, whether that's having a career or whether that's, being involved in civic service or volunteering, whatever it might be, women who have historically, when finding themselves in influential class, have then decided to spread, social norms that devalue motherhood. The result of that has been that other women around them have fewer children, and that's a net evolutionary for them.
I mean, you say that this element of female psychology threatens civilization, but obviously civilizations have existed in the past, and this sort of element of female psychology has always been present. So, what social customs or laws um, have existed in those past civilizations which have allowed them to have, a long existence? And when does it sort of start to go, and why does it start to go off the rails?
So I think that the key there is that they're past civilizations, right? They're not here anymore, right? So as soon as you're talking about past civilizations, it's, the West has a very long, illustrious life as well.
Mm.
But at some point will be a past civilization too. And so I don't think that there is an answer to this. So if the question you're asking is what is it that this society can do to stave this off, then I'm
Mm.
quite pessimistic, and I don't think there is anything we can do. So that and that is both a very pessimistic view and a quite a massive statement, which I hope is wrong. So I genuinely hope it's wrong, but I don't believe it's wrong. I don't actually believe it's wrong. So putting aside kind of the apparent decline of Western civilization and whether that can be reversed or not, putting that
Certainly, the
aside.
birth rates, but certainly the birth rates are, catastrophic across the West
The
and
birth
elsewhere.
rates are catastrophic, but it's more than just the birth rates are catastrophic. So, let me finish the point I was gonna make, and then let's come back to what else is happening
Mm.
as well, 'cause it goes beyond just birth rate decline. It's not that simple.
No.
Um, so the other point I was gonna make is that, you often get people coming up with, policymakers, well-meaning policymakers. I don't wanna disparage people, because I certainly don't have the answers either, but, you get well-meaning, policymakers that come up with ideas that, "Oh, well, we're gonna do this, and this is gonna magically solve that problem." And very frequently, those ideas are just the human equivalent of a rabbit saying, "I know what I'll do. Next time I'm being chased by a fox, I'll just sprout wings, and then I'll fly away." Now, that would be a perfect solution, but it's not going to happen, right? The rabbit's physiology, even if we're talking about, if we're talking not about an individual rabbit, but talking about the rabbit population coming up with a plan for its own evolution to evolve
Mm.
wings so that rabbits will one day be able to fly away from foxes. The biology and the physiology and the mechanics of rabbits mean they are never going to grow wings. It's never going to happen, so it's never going to be able to be selected for. And we see a similar problem with people, and people coming up with these sort of various social engineering ideas to solve crime, or to solve, it's frequently around crime, to solve this and to solve that.
Mm.
And often those ideas are predicated on some basic tenet of human nature not being the way it is. And this is what I was saying earlier in our talk, where I was saying that we sort of have people who are really strongly connected to an explanation of the world that is not as it is, but as they would like it to be. And they've lost sight of the fact that what they want the world to be is not actually what it is. Human beings are not a blank slate of a creature who can just collectively decide that we are not going to rape anymore. We are not going to tolerate it. We are not going to do it. And somehow, if we just all believe that hard enough, then it will disappear and it won't happen anymore. You can't fundamentally change the nature of being human. The only way you can socially engineer anything is to come up with a solution that exploits human nature for what it is, doesn't attempt to actually try and change human nature. So if we are to come up with a solution to this, to what is the decline of civilization, then it has to be a solution that exploits all of these motives that I'm talking about now. And I'm not sure that there is one. Maybe there may have been one a long time ago, but I think we are too far down the path now to attempt to engineer the kind of social engineering that would actually be needed to fundamentally change the way people are behaving at the moment. Because it's not. It's what I was saying before, is it's not just the second thing I was going to get to. It's not just about birth rate decline. That's a very obvious one. It's got a metric attached to it,
Mm.
and we can look at it and we can project it and we can go, yeah, it's actually not very far into the
Well, it's
future.
once you, because you can't
Zero.
avoid it. It's an obvious indication in
Yeah, that's
many
right. It's
cases.
the really obvious one,
Yeah.
but it's not the only one, right? It's
Yeah.
what's happening when birth rates decline. That's not the only thing that's happening. It's not like society is rumbling along just as
Mm.
well as it before, but we just are having fewer babies and it's a real head scratch. No, no, no. The whole of the society's institutions are being undermined and degraded, right? And this is the problem. So what we're seeing is a systematic takedown of the meritocracy, and it's most clear in those institutions that are dominated by women, where we're seeing these anti-natalist ideologies, and and associated ideology. So it's not just anti-natalism. The other big one is the anti-meritocracy. So, the DEI sounds lovely on paper, and maybe if, again, if human beings were fundamentally different, maybe it would have been instantiated the way it looks on paper. And it would have been used purely to, increase diversity of opinion and diversity of views by making sure that you had a diversity of people with diversity of backgrounds in any given space where there's important decision making to be made. That would have been great, right? Many different voices coming in so that we can get it from all angles. But of course, that's not what it's actually being used for, and not how it's actually being instituted. Instead, it's being used as an anti-meritocracy. It's being used to undermine the overall quality of whatever body of people it is in that particular institution. We're watching, I mean, everyone from, not everyone, because some people I don't believe can see it, but I think it's pretty obvious from outside the academy, and it's obvious to a lot of people from inside the academy, the degradation of the academy. And I think that, not entirely unfairly, that the academy's got quite a bad name for being an ivory tower and being out of touch. But what people need to remember is that the academy is the institution that, Western civilizations, but other civilizations have had their own knowledge houses. But that's the institution that we set up to be the safeguard of the collective accumulated knowledge of our civilization. It's an incredibly important institution. And for it to begun to be ripped down, we're seeing the consequence of that. So, when, education is perhaps one of the ones whose consequences are most obvious most clearly. Education research became very on ascientific, perhaps might be the way for it.
Yeah.
And what we see happening in schools, all of these theories about education and theories about how to teach children, that has resulted in literacy and numeracy rates plummeting. And that's not an Australian comment. That's just a general worldwide comment. So it's not just birth rate decline. What we're seeing is a slow and careful takedown of society's load-bearing pillars. And the rest of society is cooperating. Society is not resisting this happening. We're largely cooperating. This is, it looks like a system that is set to self-destruct. So the question has to be asked, why do we have a system when it finds its key load-bearing pillars being challenged, instead of retaliating harshly? But that's what you would expect civilizations to be selected to do, to retaliate harshly against those threats. They capitulate instead.
Yeah. I mean, there's a famous line by the historian Livy that we cannot tolerate the disease nor the remedy. So in a sense, but he was writing that in Augustus Caesar's time, when they were introducing, like you said, baby bonuses and bachelor taxes.
Yeah.
It did last for a while longer, a couple of hundred years. So it wasn't an immediate collapse, even though the signs were probably there at that place. Is there really nothing that can be done, I wonder, though? Even though I accept these sort of drivers and it's hard to turn the ship around, isn't it too kind of fatalistic or reductionist or deterministic, this view?
It is incredibly fatalistic. And this is this is one of the problems that, to some extent, I have. So if I was a policymaker, in fact, if I was let's just go with a sports coach, that's an easier thing, right? You don't want players on the team that don't actually believe you can win, right?
Yeah.
I mean, if you've got a whole team of men who don't actually believe they can win the grand final, versus a whole team of men who genuinely believe they can win the grand final, well, with given equal skill and equal everything else, one of those teams is going to win a lot more often, right? So, and the reason for that, just from a straight psychology perspective, of people who don't know, the reason for that is that your decision making, a huge part of your decision making, is contingent on your expected return on investment and return on effort. So the team that genuinely believes it can win is actually going to try harder to win. The team that doesn't believe it is just not going to, even if they want to try as hard, even if they're trying to try as hard, they won't try as hard, right? So the effort that you put in is always contingent on your expected returns on that effort. That's not something people can just overcome by trying to, right? So you don't want someone attempting to save the world that doesn't believe the world can be saved, right? So now we've got a problem, because I've sort of come up with a partly predictive and somewhat descriptive
You're
explanation.
a you're a doctor who's identified the disease but can't provide a pill to cure it.
That's right. Well, even worse than that. It's not that I can't provide a pill, it's I'm not sure there is one, which is
Mm,
worse. That's a much worse situation, right? That the last thing you
yeah.
want to hear from a doctor is that there
Are they?
actually isn't.
Yeah. I mean, it's striking that, at least in the Western civilizations, some of the key kind of narrative stories, religious ones, tend to be focused on the birth of children. Like Abraham, that was apparently 100 when he had Isaac, I think, and then obviously in the Christian story, that's the nativity. The status of women and mothers would have been, I suspect, been much higher in a way than it is in modern society because of that sort of reinforcement. And a lot of what I understand through your thesis is that there's these either intentional or at the very least signals that are given throughout society against motherhood
The
and
the devaluing of motherhood.
devaluing in a variety of different ways. And so, isn't it isn't the core thing to change the signaling, not the material, not giving a baby bonus or not giving necessarily any material incentives, but the messaging needs to be
Yes.
much more
Yeah.
positive. Yep.
Look, you're right. That would be a way to do it. But the question then becomes, how do we actually do that? So you take a recent example from France. So Macron, I think this is probably maybe going back 6 months. I'm not quite sure how long, but Macron announced that he was going to make fertility testing freely available to all women. I forget the age, relatively young women. So it might have been all women up to some certain age. He was going to make all fertility testing freely available. And the idea was that because so many women are leaving it until their mid-30s and later to even begin to try to have families, when women who then reach that point in time and discover that they have fertility problems, it's often too late to do anything about it. So if those women, there's no pressure necessarily on, being brought to bear on women to have children sooner. What he's just making available fertility testing, not fertility support, not IVF, just testing to find out, so that in your later life family planning, whether what your reasonable likelihood of conception is once you start trying. The feminists went nuts. They hated the idea. How dare you invest in that when there are so many more important things to invest in? And so
Mm,
that's an attempt to, provide a service to women that would hopefully, identify those women who wanted to have children but might face problems later. But what it did was create an opportunity for feminists to signal how devalued motherhood was. So it's
but
going to be very difficult to
yeah, I was just going to
change
say, mm,
those signals
yeah.
when the
So
people with the microphone aren't the ones spreading them.
I got it, but I'm just trying to work out whether ideology or politics has any relevance, because it seems to be that you say the sort of the drivers is this subconscious evolutionary biology. Parliament's discussions in Parliament don't really matter, but wouldn't it be possible to sort of at least explain or describe why some of these ideologies are bad and turn public opinion around, or is that too
I
wildly optimistic?
Look, no, I got look, part of me thinks it's wildly optimistic, but okay, the most optimistic kind of take on this I guess I can give is that there's a couple of things that it's important to observe. So number one, we can certainly learn from history. So there's a few things that we know about what's happening now that we know are not unique to the West, right? We know that you get a decline in birth rates, you get an increase in female representation in the institutions, whether that's the civic institutions or the workforce or whatever it might be, just greater, I mean, it's simple maths, right? If you take away the number of hours that women
Mm,
have to invest in raising children, well, they're going to invest those hours in doing something else, aren't they? And we know from, basic kind of evolution 101, mostly what they're going to be investing in ultimately are activities that will either boost their own reproductive success or lower the reproductive success of others. That's what people are going to do with their available time. Right, that we know that's just basic evolution. That's what's been selected for. Okay, so we've got a whole bunch of these women entering into society's institutions and turning those institutions effectively against, you know, natalist ideas, and turning those institutions anti-natal. So you end up with a society that is itself just not conducive to people having children. And as a result, people tend not to have children. The other
mm,
interesting thing to note from this evolutionarily is that in order for this entire theory to work, it's not the case that society is shutting itself down, right? That's actually, that's genetically, that's not the case. What's actually happening is because reproductive success is relative, not absolute. If you have two children in a population where the average woman is having 1.2, then you're going to win and your genes are going to perpetuate and become overrepresented. If you have two children in a population where the average is 5.4, well, you're going to be, you're going to be reduced. Your representation is going to be reduced in future generations. So what's happening is that the women who are winning the reproductive race are those, a little bit like the CEOs I mentioned before, who are actually having 2 and 3 kids, whilst all the women they employ are not. Right? So what you've actually got is you've got women who are continuing to have babies at above the the population background rate. It doesn't have to be much above that population background rate. And what this whole social circumstance is bringing on, the inevitability that it's bringing on, is what you call a genetic bottleneck, where a very small number of genetic lineages will then become a founder population for whatever rises up out of the ashes for the next civilization. So genetically, it's not about sort of, society shutting itself down or individuals ultimately, ending their own genetic lineages. The winners of this competition are the ones whose lineages remain at the end. And they're the ones who are driving these anti-natalist positions, but not embodying them, right? So there's this tension between promoting these views, but not embodying them. So there are individuals within us who are promoting all of this stuff very heavily and promoting all of these ideals and encouraging it. And these are the individuals that have a strong voice in society, but they're not embodying it. And they are the ones actually winning this game. And they are the ones whose genes founded our civilization. They are the ones whose lineages will found the next civilization. So there's a cyclical inevitability about this. That it's
God,
very
it's so dark in many
yeah.
ways to think about. Maybe human nature is dark, yeah.
But we'll get to the optimistic bit, right? So the optimistic bit is that every civilization is different, and what does set our civilization apart from every civilization in the past that has collapsed and died for whatever reason it might have been, whether let's assume I'm right about this, and therefore most civilizations don't collapse on their own. They ultimately end up getting taken over because that's what happens. Like animals never starve to death out in the wild. If they get too hungry, they end up getting eaten by something else because they're weak and they're looking for food in very risky places, right? So the same thing happens with the civilizations. They're not left to die on their own, right? Something else ultimately takes them down. But if my theory is correct, this is what leads to them being sufficiently weak that they can get taken down. And if left alone, they would eventually collapse. But every civilization is different. And one of the things that sets perhaps the thing that sets the West now apart from all civilizations in the past is the access to knowledge and technology that we have that we didn't have in the past. So no other civilization has encountered this problem with the level of knowledge and the level of technology that we have. And so I think if there is going to be a solution, the solution is going to come from understanding the cause of the problem. That's hard because this is not a message that most people want to hear. So actually having an understanding of what the problem is and having an understanding of that problem in the minds of the people whose job it is to actually think about stuff. The academy is not very receptive to these ideas, right? So that's a challenge in itself. But having an understanding of the problem, then working out what are the possible ways that problem could be ameliorated, and perhaps do we have the technology or the knowledge to implement things that other civilizations just didn't have at their disposal? That's that's what it's going to be. That's what it's going to come down to.
I also worry perhaps that some of the technologies that we have exacerbated the problem, right? I mean, I'll throw it out there because I was curious about it. What's your view of dating apps and OnlyFans? Do they fit into your theory as well? Do they accelerate the issues?
So they certainly don't help the situation. So one of the things we haven't spoken about yet that is kind of a key part of the theory is that one of the primary ways through which reproductive manipulation happens is by lowering the market price of sex. And so one of the reasons why we are seeing increases in casual sex and OnlyFans, becoming extremely popular, and even the large number of women. So if we sort of set aside for a minute the sort of the outliers, like I don't know, like Bonnie Blue and those kinds of ones. But I saw a really frightening stat the other day that something like 11% of US women over a certain age, I presume 18 or maybe 21, given that it was the US, I don't know where the data came from, something like 11% have an OnlyFans account. That is a large number of women who are attempting to make money that way. So one of the things that also goes along again with civilizational decline, but fits in with the female intersexual competition explanation of it, is this really hard reduction in the market price of sex. So the value of sex, right? You increase the supply, the price of it goes down, and its value goes down, and the mate value of women goes down when they lower their market price of sex. Right. So in order for women will increase their mate value by being, effectively very difficult to have sex with. So women who are easy to have sex with automatically lower their mate value on the mating market. And so one of the consequences of the sexual revolution, and again, we see, things that look a little bit like sexual revolutions in other societies as well. It goes along with women's increased role in civic society. What you see is this embracing of casual sex and embracing of free sex and embracing of very cheap sex.
Can I ask
And
a
so,
quick question? Just to
yeah,
jump in there. I mean, you're an evolutionary biologist, but there would be religious people who agree with some of these criticisms of sexual mores and stuff. Are you? Do you come from a religious tradition, or is that?
not especially, no. So I mean, I certainly grew up a Catholic, and a reasonably hard Catholic as well. So my mum was very religious, maybe less so now, but she was very religious back when I was growing up. So I grew up a Catholic. But I think, and I'm not practicing now. And you're right. It is interesting, and I think I read a passage by someone else a little while ago who was making a really, really good observation about the importance of Christianity to the Western tradition, and it's underappreciated because and the point he was making is that if Richard Dawkins had shown humans and Christianity the same respect that he shows a polar bear. So a polar bear is white, right? He lives in the North Pole and he's white. Now, you understand why other animals in the North Pole are white, right? They need camouflage. What does a polar bear need camouflage from? Why is he white? Right, that's a bit of a conundrum, right? And this guy suggested that if people like Richard Dawkins had shown Christianity and the human species as much respect as he showed the polar bear, and the amount of scientific effort that goes into actually working out
not dismissing the social architects which have formed part of what they're heard. Yeah.
That's right. Instead of attacking Christianity, he might have sought to understand why it was such a central pillar of the spread of Western civilization.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, there have been the civilizations which have lasted. I mean, arguably have endured. The Chinese would say their civilization is continuous to the well into the 13th century BC or thereabouts. I imagine there would be many in the Jewish community who would say that there is a continuum between the time of Abraham and today. I mean, you can make arguments about that. And one is the Chinese are not particularly. They have the traditional religion certainly existed in a deep way and was probably underappreciated, but obviously the Jews did. And I'm just wondering whether they're just outliers or whether there's anything in that sort of we might learn from.
Look, look, and there's certainly, you can trace, roots of modern Christianity back to the Middle East as well, and say Christianity has lasted 2,000 years. But I think there's a difference between whether you want to call them civilizations or populations or nation states. And, in biology, we tend to use population because it doesn't imply a particular boundary. And we define it how it's kind of just how it is practically defined in any given scenario. So that's kind of the word that you tend to use. So you talk about the population, and for some purposes, the population you consider might be larger, and the population might be more local depending on the forces. But I would argue that in terms of talking about biological populations rising and falling, you don't have continuity of the Jewish people in a single population in a particular area. And and I think that generally speaking, you don't tend to see that continuity. You don't tend to see it very often. You might get continuity of traditions, and you might get continuity of religions and continuity of beliefs, but that's not the same as suggesting that those particular societies did not at various points in time undergo quite serious collapses and then regenerations and rebirths. So I'm very, very far away from an expert on Chinese history, but I would
Sure.
hazard a guess that there's not a continuous flourishing China that looks exactly like the China
Yeah.
of today,
I mean,
right? It's
interestingly, a little bit of trivia, the Chinese character for goodness um, is made up of a mother and a child, a woman and a child. Like, so they would use that every day.
Yeah.
It's just an interesting factoid. Make of it what you will. I'm conscious we've taken a fair amount of time, and I don't want to keep you forever because I try and keep these to an hour. So I'll finish up with some questions, final questions. What's the best argument you've encountered that makes you question your thesis? And is there any sort of experiment that you could run to try to validate or invalidate elements of it?
So, in terms of experiments, hard to say. I am sort of, at the moment in the process of attempting to collect data, looking at various types of feminism, anti-natalism, looking at what predicts it, and most importantly, trying to identify the what I see as kind of potentially the weak point of the theory, which is identifying these women who promote these ideals but don't embody them. Who, that core group of women has to exist, or the theory can't be right. You know,
Mm,
uh, you cannot have an evolved sort of, large, complicated social behavior, which is what I'm sort of suggesting we've got here, a quite large, complicated social system that evolves in this, to go through these types of cycles. That's only going to happen if you have that continuation. So identifying who those women are and what sets them apart from other women. So, who they are, do they exist, and what sets them apart from other women.
mm,
And ultimately, if they can't be identified, if there is nothing that brings those women together, the ones who are in the minority of the women who are still having, a lot of children, and doing so successfully. So having children who then themselves grow up to have children.
mm,
If we can't identify those women, or there is nothing coherent about them that groups them together, then I can't be right. Right. So that those women have to exist. So the research I'm doing at the moment is trying to identify who is it that promotes this stuff but doesn't embody it. That's sort of research question number one. In terms of having heard, you know, good arguments against this, and what will give me pause, I don't think I've heard any, and I'm not sure. I'm not sure that I will. So, this is something that I've been thinking about and talking with some colleagues and collaborators about for quite a long time. So, and when you think about something for that long, and you talk about it with a lot of people, and they bring different ideas, and you look at it and you think about it and you percolate on it, you end up in a situation where you've already thought about a lot of alternative possibilities and rejected them, which is why you've still landed on this one. And this idea is certainly not looked like this for the whole time. So this idea had its birth at a conference in 2015 with a collaborator of mine whose name's also Dani Wagstaff. So she's Dani W and I'm Dani S. And it started with a conversation between the two of us there about the fact that female intersexual competition was just completely poorly understood in the literature. It was just fundamentally wrong the way it was understood. And so we started talking about these ideas, and it's taken sort of, me with some help from her and some help from other people, 10 years to sort of get to the point now where I'm quite confident that this is it may not be the explanation for the birth rate decline, but I think it is very close to the ultimate explanation for a lot of the factors that are contributing to birth rate decline. It is a fundamental organizing principle of society. And if I'm wrong about that, good. That would be much better than being right about it. But the thing is, I don't think I am. I don't think
mm.
I am. So I might be wrong about bits of it. There might be parts of it that have to change, and something might not work the way I see it working now. But I do find it quite difficult to believe that I'm wrong about the basic underlying premise, and that I'm too confident about at the moment. But I will continue to argue with people, because there are certainly people who disagree with me,
Mm.
and maybe someone will say something that gives me pause for thought. But I have been thinking about this for a long time, so I'm not quite sure that's going to happen. But
And
maybe.
we've only scratched the surface, and there's lots of elements to it which are inherently interesting as all male female relations are, and will always be, I think, a bit of a mystery, as they probably should be. Um, I was jogging along this morning, exercising, and I was listening to Lana Del Rey, American pop star, and she has a song, "Watching the Boys," and it's a sort of haunting song. And one of the lyrics is, "I know what only the girls know. Lies can buy eternity." And I thought, it's kind of what you're getting at. It's this thing where there's this ingrained thing where they're focusing on well, a type of eternity that they will pass on. She may have not had that intention, but I did think it was strangely relevant. Hey, I've really enjoyed chatting, Dani, and I really do think you're making very original contributions and interesting research in this area, which is, you can't say, to be frank, about a lot of academics in Australia or even globally. So I appreciate connecting. I appreciate the conversation, and look forward to keeping in touch. I'll
Yeah,
drop your website where people can check out your stuff in the show notes.
yeah,
And
yeah.
I
My Twitter
think it's the
handle
best way.
is the
Yeah,
best
yeah,
place.
and there's a Substack there, and the usual stuff. So yeah, follow Dani, and great to chat again. Thanks again.
Thanks very much. I've really enjoyed it.
Cheers now. Bye.